We've reached section 5.3, which has the title, The Epistemological Failure of Unbelief, as I've written up here. And the theme is going to be the epistemological collapse of any non-Christian worldview. Recall that chapter 4 focused on epistemology proper, with various reflections on what justified true belief is, and specifically how the Christian worldview provides a basis for justified true belief. And then chapter 5 pulled the camera back, so to speak, and observed that epistemology can't be separated from metaphysics and ethics. The worldview takes up all three of these necessarily. Each of them implies the other, and that therefore the apologetic method is going to have to do the same thing. And 5.2 focused on the attitude and outlook, antithesis and attitude and outlook, exposing the various ways in which the non-Christian and Christian are at an antithesis with each other in this broader worldview view of the situation. So now when we come to 5.3, Bahnsen is organizing material that now gets into the unbeliever's worldview to show the specifically epistemological failure, the inability to provide an epistemology. And so he starts with, well, skipping the first paragraph on page 311, he starts with another very nice summary of kind of the thing that the Christian worldview brings to the table. I read another one that was at the very beginning of chapter 5 a couple of videos ago, which was also quite good, but this would be another one to draw a couple of double lines in the column to keep coming back to. He says, the Christian worldview begins with the personal, self-sufficient, sovereign, and triune God, who created all things from nothing and made man to be his image. God knows all things and directs all events by his wise providential plan. Thus, all objects, properties, minds, events, general laws, and moral prescriptions are determined, controlled, and related to each other by the mind of the Lord. Skipping a dozen sentences or so. Given this overall picture of God, the world, man, value, history, and salvation, the basic biblical world and life view, the Christian can give an account of the objectivity of truth, the mind's correspondence to objects and other minds, the possibility of knowledge, the rational and empirical procedure by which we learn, test, and justify propositions, the possibility of our finite minds knowing universal, absolute, and prescriptive concepts and laws, the human tendency toward disagreement, prejudice, and irrationality, etc. And the part I skipped there was backfilling the special revelation aspects as well, the New and Old Testament, including the revelation of man as a sinner, blinded by his own willfulness, and so forth. So next he's going to argue that the variety of non-Christian worldviews, and there's many out there, all boil down to a negation of one or more of these propositions that have been used to describe the Christian worldview. He says, top of page 312, there is at base only one non-Christian worldview. Logically speaking, it is the negation of the overall picture described above. The denial of some or all of the propositions used to summarize biblically based Christianity, e.g., the Trinity, creation, providence, sin, incarnation, redemption, regeneration. So, as I mentioned in the earlier videos, the strategy here seems to be to reduce the Christian worldview to a finite list of propositions or sets of propositions, and then show that the unbeliever's worldview is a denial of one of those and therefore fails. So if I should just show this schematically, you have this set of propositions, let's just say P1, P2, etc., where P1 might be there exists the triune God, P2 might be that God has created all things, P3, he providentially steers and ordains whatsoever comes to pass, and so forth. So we make a list of the propositions. Now what the apologetic starts to do is to show that these various non-Christian worldviews are a denial of one or more of these propositions, and that within their own internal logic, they fail to account for knowledge. So in other words, the negation of P1 implies no knowledge. And then another worldview might be used to exemplify the denial of P2, and that also ends up destroying knowledge, and so forth. And so then you finally end up with the fact that if there is such a thing as knowledge, by the contrapositive of these statements, you have the conjunction of all those. I'm leaving out a lot of steps, but you could do that. And so that's pretty good if you show that the necessity, the possibility of knowledge, and of course we're going to argue that if the unbeliever's strategy is to say, well, I guess we just don't have knowledge then, as Bahnsen would often say, well, let me hold the microphone up for you to say that into the microphone. In other words, they've kind of thrown in the towel at that point. If knowledge is not possible, then the apologetic task ends at that point. And then you have to encourage the unbeliever to live consistently with that proposal. See if he can live consistently with saying there's no such thing as knowledge. Now, the problem here is that we had that Christianity implies P1 and P2, basically this thing here. So we have Christianity implies the conjunction of those propositions. Knowledge implies the conjunction of those propositions. But of course, we'd be committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent if we said, therefore, Christianity. What we need is for the conjunction of these propositions to imply Christianity. Where, let me just write down how I've defined some of these constants in case it's not easy to follow. C equals Christianity and K equals knowledge. And of course, I'm not using proper logical form here. We'd have to expand these into declarative propositions and perhaps use sets of propositions and so forth. So I'm only schematizing by what I'm showing here to try to give the picture of where the argument seems to be going as Bahnsen is presenting it here. So the question is whether we can go both directions. In other words, if you have, and not the triune God, this would have to be something like a God that contains unity and diversity within himself. And he's the creator of all things and of us. Therefore, our mind can reach out of itself to the rest of creation to have knowledge. So in other words, we show these various attributes of Christianity. But now the question is that sufficient to give certainty that the unbeliever can embrace Christianity? In other words, suppose the unbeliever would throw in the towel and say, well, I agree that we need a God that's both unitary and diverse, and we need him to have created us and the rest of the world so that we have a mind that meets the universe and also is able to use induction because he steers all things according to his plan, and he creates contingency because he acts freely, etc., etc. But that doesn't imply it's Christianity. It could be some other religion that we haven't discovered yet. And so that's going to be kind of the question, perhaps, that you should hold in the back of your mind as we go through these readings. I think there is good answers to that question, but I don't think it can be reduced to a simple logical formula. It's going to involve an existential aspect and an historical aspect. Because after all, we're not presenting Christianity as an abstract projection of our rational thinking. It's that here it is. We have revelation that we're presenting to the world. We're saying this is revealed of God. So there is an empirical aspect to the presentation of Christianity. And then there has to be, in the nature of the case, revelation is going to be a concrete revelation. Anyway, so let's continue. He mentions again the resorting to randomness, and as I mentioned last time, we can substitute for that the random determinist dialectic. So even if you think the universe is deterministic, it's still random in terms of our ability to project and reason from that basis. Page 314. The various schools of philosophy set forth by unbelievers cannot explain man's personal and intellectual freedom in a mechanical world. They cannot provide for a reliable connection between the mind and its objects, or the mind and other minds. They cannot escape the egocentric predicament, subjectivism and relativism. Footnote 105. Bahnsen has sort of a very nice one-paragraph overview of the entire history of, well, at least of the rationalist and empiricist schools of philosophy. He doesn't address Plato and Aristotle here. But how deplorable it is that these great minds can't even come to fundamental agreement on these basic issues. He says, just think of the continental rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, who began with supposedly clear and distinct, self-evident ideas, and yet derived from them radically and embarrassingly divergent conclusions about reality. Dualism, monism, and pluralism, respectively. Then consider the British empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Berkeley, I guess they say, who traced the mind's ideas back to individual sensations. Notice again the internal subjective locus, only to render a substance that unites properties inexplicable, Locke, to dispense with material substance, Berkeley, and then to lose altogether any mental substance or self that unites perceptions, Hume. As Kant concluded, to the degree the mind knows its own inner contents, constituted by its own activity informing the input of the senses, it still has no knowledge of things in themselves outside the mind. The predicament is that man as a knower can never get outside the ideas formed within himself. When the unbeliever begins his philosophizing with himself at the center, he ends up unable to escape himself, subjectivism. And since every unbeliever faces the same dilemma, nobody can speak with authority about objective reality for anybody else, relativism. So I think this is a very powerful criticism of the non-Christian approach to philosophy. Devastating, in fact. But it still leaves unanswered this question over here. Page 315, he summarizes once again. Non-Christians cannot give a philosophically adequate account of the universality and invariance of the laws of logic or the laws of morality, much less how the unchanging abstract laws or concepts could accurately reflect the completely different realm of constantly changing, brute, physical facts outside the mind. They fail to provide a justification for the scientific or inductive reasoning that is utilized in virtually everything we know and can communicate. The meaningfulness, communicability, and creativity of languages are mutually inexplicable. Skipping half of that paragraph. Throughout his writings at various points, Van Til would pick out one or another illustration of the underlying non-Christian worldview to make his point that unbelief represents an epistemological failure. He was bold to declare, "We believe that which is in the Bible to be the only defensible philosophical position, the only position that makes human predication intelligible." Human predication meaning the ability to make judgments or form sentences or logical sentences that have a truth value that corresponds with something objective. And the history of autonomous thought bears this out. Continuing Van Til, we shall have to approach the matter of a Christian world and life view from an historical point of view. We are naturally persuaded that in history lies the best proof of our philosophy of human life. And this, I think, is a very key insight that ratifies what I was saying a minute ago, that the presentation of Christianity as the revelation of God is not an abstract deduction of rational thought, but rather a presentation of that which we have, the "Thus saith the Lord" that we have written down, which came in history. And we are historical. We have development that and our minds have a history that moves, we hope, from error to truth, more often than not, and so forth. And not only that, but then humanity itself has a history. And so, if you think about it, it could be that there were times in the history of Israel where Israel thought of Jehovah as their warrior king fighting against other tribal deities. That is, that wouldn't bother me if it turned out to be the case. Because the point is that our God is the true God. He defeats the other ones, and he's the one that made the heavens and the earth. And so it wouldn't bother me at all if they kind of emerged with a persuasion that came from very concrete embattlement between Jehovah and the other gods. Whereas for us, after the passage of centuries, we have more philosophical desires to achieve that same sense of certainty. But now we have also knowledge of the entire world. The Bible is really the only book claiming to be a "Thus saith the Lord." Again, leaving aside the Quran, which I discussed how that should be handled. But really, like Confucius, Krishna, the other gurus of history, there's really no testimony of them saying, this is the word of the Almighty God, the eternal God that created heavens and earth. It's more like, well, our wise men think things through this way, that all is eventually one. It's much more philosophical. The Bible really is the only candidate out there for this, and it only stands to reason that the living and true God that created language and that speaks and allows us to speak would reveal himself verbally. So in other words, my point being that the idea that there might be some other revelation undiscovered, like say in the jungles of the Congo, that is the real living and true God, and that we've just been duped by this pretension, even though this pretension has created the entire history of the world that we live in, is unreasonable. And if it's unreasonable, then you shouldn't be tempted by it. So I'm not necessarily stating things the way Van Til or Bahnsen would state them, but I'm trying to stimulate thought along the lines of what Van Til is getting here when he says that the historical method is going to be the favored one to show our position. Continuing with Bahnsen, page 316. In the reading selections below, we will sample some of Van Til's discussion of this epistemological failure throughout the history of autonomous philosophy. These are valuable for their variation and details. Following them, we will consider a few of the more general lines of criticism that Van Til would address in a blanket fashion to any and all unbelieving worldviews and their theories of knowledge. And so here again, we have 5 or 6 bullets. So again, we're reducing this big concept of the worldview to a very small, finite list. The problem of brute facts, the problem of continuity and contingency, the problem of relating logic to facts, the problem of phenomenalism, which he explains as the mind knowing only itself, not the external world, like sense data. You know, the empiricists wanted us to start with sense data. I see a brown blob, but that's all in my mind. How am I going to get out to really know some object out in the world that corresponds to the brown blob I see in my mental image? He calls that the problem of phenomenalism. And finally, the critique for which Van Til is best remembered by his students, the rational-irrational tension that afflicts all unbelieving thought. Footnote 109. The terms rational and irrational are given a wide variety of definitions in philosophical literature and teaching. For instance, rational can describe what pertains to man's intellect, or to the attitude of autonomy from God, or to a specific school of epistemology that affirms the possibility of knowledge independent of observation, etc. As Van Til uses this pair of terms to describe the dialectical tension in autonomous theorizing, the rational tendency is to view man's mind as competent to describe reality accurately and serve as the final authority for all claims to knowledge. The irrational tendency in any philosophy is its admission of intellectual unreliability and limitations, its inability to comprehend everything or even to anticipate what factors it may be unaware of, and its lack of certainty in the face of skepticism and mystery. Well, I would say that's a pretty good starting point for the rational and irrational dialectic. But I think sometimes irrational also means non-rational. So the contingent, the given. So the fact that we are minds that are thrown into a world of givenness shows the rational-irrational dilemma, because the given is irrational in the sense that it's not deduced or anticipated. It's just given, like it comes without being a product of reason. And then our reason deals with that. So I think sometimes that's more the polarity that's being highlighted. Thought I'd just mention that. Bahnsen explains the rational-irrational dialectic further at the bottom of page 317. On the one hand, the unbeliever will be a rationalist who is committed to the competence of the human mind, while on the other hand, he will resort to an irrationalist mindset that cannot find a secure starting point in a changing universe or escape the deadly challenge of skepticism. This tension or incoherence in the unbeliever's approach to knowledge manifests itself not simply as a philosophical quandary for the unbeliever, but also expresses itself in his intellectual attempts to repudiate the Christian faith. In this memorable summary of the would-be autonomous man's declaration to the Christian, Van Til highlights the conflicting rational and irrational themes of unbelief. Nobody knows anything for sure, but we know that you are wrong. And that brings us to page 318, which is the beginning of the Van Til readings. And these Van Til readings are gathering together various writings that he gave on specific philosophers to illustrate the material we just went through, to show their epistemological collapse, starting with Plato. So I'm looking forward to going through these, because finally we get something concrete and juicy that we can sink our teeth into. See you then.